Grüß, willkommen in einem Nachfolgendes video, or welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 2 of my series on Corps Commander rules training videos. This video will provide an overview of the Corps Commander Operational Maneuver Group sequence of play, which also applies to the Road to Berlin version of Corps Commander. While going through the sequence of play in some form of detail is boring, it's important to know what is possible and when it occurs. Corps Commander uses a simultaneous fire phase followed by 2 sequential movement phases, one for each player. Command functions are also sequential and occur before player movement. In summary, a player needs to set up their fire in the previous game turn. This is not an ideal sequence of play and does require extra record keeping, but at the time it was created it was state of the art and does work well. Phase 1 is the initiative phase, during which each player determines their initiative total for the current game turn. This will determine movement order, whether a breakthrough move will occur, and if applying the optional weather rules, if a weather change will occur. Phase 2 is the fire phase, during which almost all fire combats occur, starting with the Smoke Barrage, both as a result of area fire or fire support. Next, all direct fire occurs. In some exceptional cases, indirect fire may occur in this subphase as well. During the indirect fire subphase, all indirect fire occurs. This includes area fire, interdiction fire, counter-battery fire, and finally, fire support. During the anti-aircraft and air attack subphase, players first conduct air-to-air combat, which includes any interceptions. Players then move to anti-radar missile fire, followed by enemy anti-aircraft fire, both missile and gunfire. Air-to-ground fire is now conducted. The phase ends with any breakthrough fire, both direct or in rare cases indirect. As you can see, this phase is not a simple phase. Phase 3 is the first player command phase, during which all supply, command and associated administrative activity occurs. The first player determines if any elements are not in command control. This is followed by the supply subphase, where the supply state of all elements is determined. During the emplacement phase, indirect fire elements such as artillery and headquarters attempt to emplace. This is followed by communications, where orders and other communications are sent. These can be intercepted by the opposing player. During the artillery allocation subphase, all allocation communications are sent, and any communication sent last game turn becomes active this game turn. The same also applies to aircraft. While complex and requiring a lot of record keeping, in most game turns players can quickly skip through these phases. For example, apart from the beginning of a game, it's rare for any area fire to occur. Most artillery start the game allocated to a headquarters, allowing for fire support, and this remains for the entire game. Even aircraft activities can be simpler than it first appears, as the number of air flights is low and the air-to-air combat is very rare. Of course, this does not mean you do not need to understand the rules, which is the real downside of Corps Commander. During Phase 4, the first player's movement phase, all movement or movement-related activities occur. This includes physical movement, mode changes, limbering or unlimbering, and mounting or dismounting. Some fire combat is possible, such as half fire by the first player and opportunity fire by the second player. During Phase 5, the second player command phase, the second player repeats the sequence outlined in Phase 3. During Phase 6, the second player movement phase, the second player repeats the sequence outlined in Phase 4. During Phase 7, the morale phase, both players conduct morale tests if required. Rallying from rout occurs during this phase as well. Any elements routing must now conduct a rout move. Phase 8, the game turn record phase, is the housekeeping phase of the game turn. Smoke markers are removed, the game turn is advanced by 1. The turn before reinforcements arrive, players determine if there are any variation in arrival game turns, and finally, any reinforcements to arrive are placed on the playing area edge, ready to arrive the following game turn. We'll now look at Phase 1, the initiative phase, in more detail. During the initiative determination subphase, each player determines their initiative total. Each player will first roll a 10-sided dice and note the value. The unmodified value is also used for weather change determination, so must be recorded for later in the initiative phase. A number of modifiers are now applied to each die roll, starting with the commanding general's initiative rating. This can range from 0 to 4 and is determined before the game starts. Next, any strategic or operational situation modifiers are applied. The player who is strategic attacker, such as the Russians in 1944, gain a +1. The player who is the operational attacker, such as the Germans in the Ardennes during 1944-45, gains a +1. In most cases, the strategic and operational attacker will be the same, thus that player gains a +2. Next, the tactical situation modifiers are applied. If playing the original rules, use the modifiers listed at the top of this screen. If using the optional attack and defend rules, replace the attacking modifiers with those at the bottom of the slide. For example, an attacker in the second quarter of a game will gain +1, but in the fourth quarter of a game he suffers a -2. In any case, apply, if applicable, the attacking at night, unengaged brigade and chemical attack modifiers in all cases. We now apply any national characteristic modifiers. Each player must identify the predominant troop type on the table, or for the defender in the first half of the game available for deployment on the playing area. At the second half of the game, this may change. In an attack and defend game, the national characteristics of the defender may change as reinforcements arrive during the second half or the third quarter. The attacking player always uses the attack modifier, the defending player always uses the defend modifier. This applies for the entire game, even when the defender counterattacks. The player with the highest total can determine movement order. If the modified die scores are equal, then the player that had the initiative on the previous move or game turn loses it in favour of the other player. If the modified die scores are equal on the first move of the battle, then the attacking player has the initiative that move. In most cases, the attacker will win the initiative on game turn 1 and will typically move second. If a player has an initiative total which is 6 or greater than its opponent, he has achieved a breakthrough. This must be noted as it allows that player an additional fire combat later in the game turn. The attacker will often achieve this during the first quarter of the game. If using the optional weather change rules, then if the attacking player initiative die roll was a 1 or 10, the weather will change for the current game turn. An unmodified die roll of 10 will cause the weather to improve 1 level. If currently at the highest level, there is no effect. An unmodified die roll of 1 will cause the weather to deteriorate by 1 level. If currently the worst level, there is no effect. Weather changes are rare, but in a typical game may occur once. This means at some point in the game, light rain or light snow may fall. The weather conditions depend on climatic region and season. In most cases, during winter, snow will occur, and during summer, rain will occur. During autumn or spring, either rain or snow could occur depending on the climatic region. If in a tropical climatic region, snow cannot occur and the occurrence of rain will increase during wet season. If in Arctic, rain cannot occur and the occurrence of snow will increase accordingly. If in desert, heat haze and dust storms will occur instead of rain or snow. We'll now look at Phase 2, the fire phase. During the fire phase, both players simultaneously conduct fire combat within each subphase. This means that during the direct fire subphase, both players simultaneously conduct direct fire, using the original strength and state of the element. Thus, any fire which results in a loss or a change in state does not affect the fire of that enemy within the same subphase. At the end of the direct fire subphase, all losses are removed and the new element state recorded, which can affect the subsequent indirect fire subphase. The Smoke Barrage subphase is the first subphase of the fire phase. During this subphase, all smoke barrages are laid down. This subphase is divided into an area fire smoke barrage step and the fire support smoke barrage step. During the area fire smoke barrage step, all pre-planned smoke barrages are executed. The target location must be observed by a friendly element using the fall of shot base observation range, and the nominated indirect fire element or artillery element must be available to conduct the smoke barrage. During the fire support smoke barrage step, any observer-sighted indirect fire or self-observed indirect fire can occur. In the case of observer-sighted indirect fire, an observer can request a smoke barrage against any currently observed enemy elements. The indirect fire element must be integral or allocated to the same headquarters as the observer, in which case it can occur immediately. In the case of self-observed indirect fire, the indirect fire element can currently observe the enemy element. In this case, the smoke barrage can occur immediately. The direct fire subphase is the next subphase of the fire phase. In this phase, both players conduct direct fire simultaneously. Any element which can observe and which has a direct line of sight to an enemy element can conduct direct fire against it. If an element lacks a direct fire capability, it can conduct self-observed indirect fire against the target, as long as it can observe the target and has a line of sight. This may occur if the element is itself under fire and wants to avoid firing after any losses due to direct fire. At the end of the subphase, all losses are removed and the element change state is noted. The indirect fire subphase is the next subphase of the fire phase, the second. In this subphase, both players conduct indirect fire simultaneously. During the area indirect fire step, all pre-planned indirect fire is executed. The target location must be observed by a friendly element using the fall of shot base observation range, and the nominated indirect fire element or artillery element must be available to conduct indirect fire. This fire is considered as unobserved as the targets are not observed, only the fall of shot. During the interdiction indirect fire step, all pre-planned interdiction fire is executed. The target location must be observed by a friendly element using the fall of shot base observation range, and the nominated indirect fire element or artillery element must be available to conduct interdiction fire. There is no actual fire combat as a result of this. Instead, an interdiction template is placed on the playing area. All elements moving through this template suffers indirect fire during their respective movement phases. This fire is considered as unobserved, as the targets are not observed, only the fall of shot. During the counter-battery fire step, all counter-battery fire is executed. The indirect fire element or artillery element must be under or allocated to a counter-battery mission order, and the enemy artillery must have been located the previous game turn, immediately after they fired during the fire phase. This fire is considered as unobserved. During the fire support indirect fire step, any observer-sighted indirect fire or self-observed indirect fire can occur. In the case of observer-sighted indirect fire, an observer can request indirect fire or fire support against any currently observed enemy element. The indirect fire element must be integral or allocated to the same headquarters as the observer, in which case it can occur immediately. In the case of self-observed indirect fire, the indirect fire element can currently observe the enemy element. In this case, the indirect fire can occur immediately. In some cases, self-observed indirect fire can occur during the direct fire subphase. The anti-aircraft and air support subphase is the following subphase of the fire phase. This is the most complex subphase of the fire phase and requires a number of slides to explain. The first step is the aircraft deployment step, during which each player moves all aircraft waiting at the edge of the table edge to their attack or observation point, except for cap aircraft, which remain on the playing area edge. Opposing cap aircraft now engage in air-to-air combat. The player with the lesser aircraft flights line up the flights in a line. The opposing player now matches each flight with a cap flight, with any remaining cap flights available for interception. Air-to-air combat between the cap flights now occurs, and this consists of long-range missile fire, short-range missile fire, and gunfire in that order. Due to a player aborting an aircraft or due to an aircraft being eliminated, some of the cap engaged in air-to-air combat may become available for intercepts in the following step. During the intercept step, all free cap flights may attack any enemy aircraft on the playing area, and these flights are placed next to their targets. In Corps Commander, all intercepts are automatic. Intercepting cap flights now conduct air-to-air combat against their targets. If a target has an escort, the cap flight can either bypass the escort and attack the target, in which case the escort can bounce the cap flight later, or the cap can first attack the escort and then attack its target. At the end of this step, all cap flights are returned to their base. During the anti-radar missile step, any flight that is equipped with anti-radar missiles can now fire these against radar-operated anti-aircraft elements within its range. During the ground-to-fire step, any anti-aircraft elements that did not receive a loss from enemy anti-radar missile may fire at any flight that is in range of its attack or observation point, or any reconnaissance flight that passes within range. Ground-to-air combat is divided into two categories: anti-aircraft guided weapons and anti-aircraft guns. During the air-to-ground step, all remaining aircraft conduct a strike, level bombing, pinpoint bombing, carpet bombing, dive bombing, ground attack bombing, ground attack rockets, ground attack guns, and anti-tank bombing conduct their respective attacks. Aircraft not conducting a second attack return to their base after the combat. During the second ground-to-air step, all eligible anti-aircraft elements conduct ground-to-air combat against any enemy aircraft within range who are conducting a second air-to-ground attack. During the second air-to-ground step, all remaining aircraft conducting ground attack bombing, ground attack rockets, ground attack guns, and anti-tank bombing conduct their respective attacks. The final subphase in the five-phase is the breakthrough fire subphase, which occurs if any player achieves an overwhelming initiative advantage. Only the player which achieves a breakthrough can conduct fire combat. During the breakthrough direct fire step, all eligible elements conduct direct fire. During the breakthrough indirect fire step, all eligible elements conducting self-observed indirect fire. Standard fire support indirect fire is not permitted during the breakthrough fire subphase. We will now look at phase 3, the first player's command phase. During the first player command phase, the first player determines command control, supply, emplacement, orders, artillery allocation, and aircraft allocation. The first player is determined during the initiative phase and may alternate between players during the course of a game. The first subphase of the first player command phase is the command control subphase. During this subphase, the phasing player determines if his on-playing area elements are in command control or not. If an element is not in command control, the phasing player needs to indicate this with a marker or counter, as this restricts what actions that element can conduct during this game turn. The next subphase in the first player command phase is the supply subphase. During this subphase, the phasing player determines the supply state of all on-playing area elements. If an element does not have a line of supply, this must be indicated with a counter or marker. Elements which do not have a line of supply for more than one game turn reduce their general supply marker for each game turn this state exists. Once all general supply has been expended, an outer supply marker is placed next to the counter or element. Each time an element which is out of supply moves or fires, a test is conducted to determine if that element is depleted. This occurs in the fire or phasing movement phase and is indicated with a counter. Any element with no line of supply, out of supply, or depleted counter on it, which now has a line of supply, has the counter removed. That element is now in supply. During the supply allocation step, the highest ranked headquarters can send a supply column order, placing a supply column counter next to the indirect fire element, which is to receive the supply column. The next subphase in the first player command phase is the emplacement subphase. During the emplacement subphase, the phasing player may attempt to emplace an indirect fire element or headquarters. Emplacing allows an element to use a telephone line of communication and allows for communication between an indirect fire element or artillery element and an allocated observer. This is required in order to conduct fire support. During the emplacement eligibility step, the phasing player determines if an element is eligible for emplacement. If this is the case, the element can begin the process of emplacing. The phasing player places an emplacement progress marker next to the element with a value equal to the emplacement level of the element attempting emplacement. During the emplacement level step, each element attempting to emplace spins a 10-sided dice to determine if the emplacement is progressing or not. If successful, the emplacement marker is reduced by 1 until it reaches 0, in which case the element is emplaced. The next subphase in the first player command phase is the Communication Subphase. During this subphase, any previously communicated orders become active. New orders can be communicated and the non-phasing player can attempt to intercept any of these communications. During the order activate step, any order communicated last game turn becomes active. If using counters, the order counter is flipped and any existing order counter is removed. During the combat order communicate step, the phasing player may communicate orders or combat orders to headquarters in command control. This can include attack, defend, retreat or maneuver. The new order counter is placed face down next to the headquarters. In the original Corps Commander, combat orders were only sent to brigade or regimental headquarters. If using the optional rules, this can extend to all headquarters. During the administrative order communicate step, the phasing player can communicate any resubordination orders. A resubordination represents the removal of an element or headquarters from its current commanding headquarters chain of command and moving it to a new commanding headquarters. A counter to this effect is placed next to the element or headquarters face down, and this takes effect next game turn. This is an incredibly rare thing during the game. The non-phasing player may now attempt to intercept any radio communication made during this phase. If successful, this is secretly recorded and allows the non-phasing player to conduct counter-battery fire against the issuing headquarters during the next game turn fire phase. The next subphase in the first player command phase is the Artillery Allocation Subphase. During this subphase, the phasing player can allocate artillery to a fire mission for the following game turn. This is similar to an order. During the artillery allocation activate step, any artillery allocation order sent during the previous game turn becomes active. The face down artillery order counter is flipped face up and any previous artillery order counters are removed. During the artillery allocation order communication step, any headquarters can send an artillery allocating order to a communicating indirect fire element or artillery element, which allocates that element to any subordinate headquarters. Place an artillery order counter face down next to the indirect fire element or artillery element and note the headquarters it's being allocated to. This becomes active during the following game turn. All elements must be in command control. Once again, this is fairly rare. Almost all indirect fire elements are allocated at the beginning of the game and they remain so for the entire game. During the area fire allocating step, pre-planned area fire can be cancelled by commanding headquarters. The cancel order is sent now and affects the indirect fire element or artillery element during the following game turn. During the interdiction fire allocating step, pre-planned interdiction fire can be cancelled by the commanding headquarters. The cancel order is sent now and affects the indirect fire element or artillery element during the following game turn. During the counter battery order step, any headquarters can send a counter battery order to its subordinate indirect fire element or artillery element. This takes effect the following game turn. During the phasing command phase, and allows the indirect fire element to conduct counter battery fire the following game turn. During to this delay, the counter fire battery has to be planned carefully and would not occur normally in an ad hoc manner. Typically, you allocate one indirect fire element as counter battery for the entire game and you never change the mission order. The final subphase of the first player command phase is the Air Operation Subphase. During this subphase, aircraft are allocated missions. In most cases, all aircraft are available on game turn 1, or their availability is determined before the game begins and indicated on the turn record chart. Once aircraft are used, they must spend a number of game turns at their base before becoming available for use again. This is determined by their sortie rate. The only exception are aircraft using a cab rank. During the air order step, orders or missions are communicated to available aircraft. Missions can be to cancel a strategic or tactical mission, or to initiate a tactical strike or bombing mission, ground attack mission, cap mission, close escort mission, reconnaissance missions, observation mission, AWAC mission, ECM mission, or ELINT mission. When the aircraft is available for use, it's placed on the player edge with the aircraft mission counter next to it. During the aircraft placement step, aircraft with a tactical strike or bombing mission are placed on the game turn record chart corresponding to the game turn the mission is to arrive. For all other missions, place the aircraft on the owning player edge with the mission counter next to it. If the aircraft is not yet available, place the aircraft on the game turn record chart corresponding to the game turn it becomes available, and then place it on the owning player's edge. If a player is using a cab rank system, aircraft are used in a similar manner to artillery. Each game turn, a number of aircraft are available for use, which is based on its minimum sortie rate. In summary, a single squadron forms a conveyor belt of aircraft which are available for use as required. During the aircraft allocation activate step, any previously sent mission orders become active. The squadron can now be allocated to an on-playing area headquarters who can request air support. The squadron can also be allocated to a headquarters to provide any type of mission, such as reconnaissance, observation, ECM, ELINT or AWAC. This allows a player to always have aircraft in the air, providing the type of indirect support or air support. During the aircraft allocation order communication step, the highest rank headquarters sends a mission to the aircraft squadron. During the following game turn, this mission becomes active. We'll now look at Phase 4, the first player's movement phase. During the first player's movement phase, all movement, mode changes, limber and unlimber, mounting or dismounting occurs. In addition, the phasing player can conduct half fire and the opposing player can conduct opportunity fire. Finally, the phasing player can initiate close assault and close combat. The first player is determined during the initiative phase and may alternate between players during the course of the game. The movement phase is divided into a number of steps, which can be conducted in any order and with any element the phasing player wishes. Thus, one element may dismount and then move in that order. The order in these slides is provided only for convenience purpose. Any element can conduct movement during the movement phase and can mix physical moving across the playing area with any of the other steps listed in this slide. Each element must first determine its movement allowance in centimetres. This requires cross-referencing its mobility rating, which can be very high mobility, standard mobility, low mobility, truck mobility, bicycle mobility, animal mobility, or infantry mobility with the terrain it will be traversing. This will give it its movement allowance in centimetres. An element can expend none, part, or all of its movement allowance in physically moving across the playing area. An element can change its mode during the movement phase. All elements must adopt one of three voluntary modes, such as travel, concentrated, or dispersed. In addition, there is an involuntary mode called disrupted mode, which is basically routing. This represents an element running away from the enemy or routing. Each voluntary mode has benefits and disadvantages, so travel mode provides an element with enhanced movement capability, but at the cost of its combat ability. Concentrated mode provides an element with standard movement and combat capability, and dispersed mode provides an element with reduced movement capacity, increased defensive capacity, but at the cost of reduced fire combat capability. Some elements are restricted in which mode they can adopt, and other elements can adopt a mode and avoid any of the negative effects. To change a mode, an element must expend a fraction of its movement allowance, so changing from travel mode to concentrated mode, or from concentrated to dispersed, expends half an element's movement allowance. Changing directly from travel to dispersed expends an entire element's movement allowance. Some elements cannot adopt concentrated mode, in which case the change from travel to dispersed costs only half an element's movement allowance. Elements may change mode during the phasing movement phase. Towed weapons need to limber to move and unlimber to conduct fire combat. Examples include howitzers, anti-tank guns, and anti-aircraft guns. An element may freely unlimber at no cost at any time during its phasing movement phase, but it costs an element half its movement allowance to limber. An element may limber at any point during its phasing movement phase as long as it has sufficient movement allowance in order to do so. It should be noted that some towed weapons can be manhandled and thus may move without its towed vehicle or animals. Infantry can be carried by vehicles or by animals, which provide it with enhanced movement capabilities. When carried in vehicles or by animals, the infantry is considered as mounted, and when they debus, they are considered as dismounted. Examples include cavalry, motorised infantry, panzer grenadiers, armoured infantry. An infantry element may freely dismount at no cost at any time during its phasing movement phase, but it costs an element half its movement allowance to mount a transport. An infantry element may mount a transport at any point during its phasing movement phase as long as it has sufficient movement allowance in order to do so. An element can expend half its movement allowance to conduct direct fire during the phasing movement phase. This is called half fire and can occur at any point in the element's normal movement. The direct fire combat is also less effective than it would be in the fire phase, depending on the stabilisation of the main weapon. An element cannot have conducted any fired combat during the preceding fire phase. This would normally be conducted at the end of the element's movement phase, so to fire at an enemy element which may not have been previously eligible to be fired at. An element can initiate and conduct close assault or close combat during the phasing movement phase, which expends half the element's movement allowance. The element must have been able to move in the area, the location, the target enemy element occupies, which means it needs the movement allowance in order to do so. Once the element has moved and expended the required movement allowance, close combat will occur. If it is successful, the attacking element will occupy the area the enemy element occupied, and the enemy element will retreat. In effect, when you conduct close combat, both elements are actually occupying the same spot on the playing area. Phase 5 is a repeat of Phase 3 and Phase 6 is a repeat of Phase 4. The only difference is the opposing player will be the phasing player. We'll now look at Phase 7, the morale phase, and Phase 8, the game turn record phase. During the morale phase, both players first conduct mandatory and voluntary morale tests. Any element still disrupted or routing then conduct a rout move. The first subphase of the morale phase is the morale test subphase. During this subphase, both players first attempt to rally any elements which are disrupted or routing. If successful, the disrupted marker is removed and the element has rallied. Next, each player conducts a morale test for any of the following causes which has occurred at any point during the current game turn. An element which suffers a dispersed result due to large guns, rockets or flamethrowers. An element is below half strength and can observe or is under fire from enemy elements. An element has a morale of 3 or less and can observe enemy elements. An element is within 6 centimeters of a friendly disrupted element. Depending on the result of the morale test, the element may become disrupted itself. Indicate this with a counter if it occurs. It should be noted, in some cases the morale test must occur immediately when the cause has occurred, such as losing 2 strength points in a single fire attack or losing 4 strength points in the entire fire phase. The final subphase in the morale phase is the rout move subphase. During the rout move subphase, any element which is disrupted or routing must make a rout move towards cover, unless they are already in cover. Players execute this movement during this subphase. All housekeeping occurs during Phase 8, the game turn record phase. The steps which are executed are listed in this slide. These activities must occur in the indicated order and are carried out by both players. The first step is the remove smoke marker step. All smoke which is on the playing area is removed. Players then advance the game turn marker 1 game turn on the game turn track. Players then determine if reinforcements arrive early, on time or late for the following game turn during the reinforcement variability step. Finally, players take any reinforcement scheduled to arrive in the current new game turn and place it on the playing area edge. Players need to note that this sequence means any reinforcements scheduled to arrive on game turn 5 are placed on the playing edge at the beginning of game turn 5. Players place any aircraft conducting missions scheduled to arrive on the player edge. Again, if an aircraft is scheduled to arrive on game turn 5, it's placed on the player edge at the beginning of game turn 5, not at the end of the game turn. Based on the original rules, the sequence of play does not indicate when reinforcements, pre-planned artillery missions or aircraft missions arrive. It's logical that this should occur at the beginning of any game turn, but this would require the creation of a reinforcement and mission arrival phase. Rather than doing this, the reinforcement and mission arrival process occurs in the housekeeping phase or game turn record phase. To avoid reinforcements or missions arriving at the end of a game turn, players advance the game turn track before they place reinforcement or missions. As a result, they are actually at the beginning of the following game turn rather than at the end of the current game turn. My apologies for this confusing process, but Bruce should have placed all housekeeping at the beginning of the game turn rather than the end. And so we come to an end of this rather long video and the end of part 2 of the Core Commander sequence of play video. Players should now continue with the training session by selecting the next video in the training sequence. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.